The clock is the enemy. August 7th, 1944. 0512 hours. The dawn has been swallowed by a thick, suffocating mist that clings to the ancient, blood-soaked hills of Mortagne in northern France. Below, in the choked, sunless valley, 3 battered American units, 2 platoons of infantry, 1 detachment of light artillery, are not sheltered. They are cornered. They had retreated into what intelligence had marked as a defensive pocket. They had stumbled into a meticulously prepared killing floor. The air thrums were low, the electric hum of dread, soon punctuated by the tearing, brutal sound of German heavy machine guns. Wehrmacht armored columns are closing the final distance, an iron vice tightening from the east and the west. Isolation is absolute. Over the crackling static of the radio, headquarters delivers the death warrant. Asterisk, hold your position. Do not engage. Reinforcements are en route. Asterisk. Inside the dense steel confines of his M4 Sherman tank, Lieutenant Carl Hartmann grips a 75mm smoke shell. It's heavy, cold, and a direct violation of standing orders. The manual calls this a wasteful expenditure. Command calls this unauthorized action. But the calculus of survival dictates otherwise. If the German SS Panzer divisions complete this final maneuver, 200 American lives, his men, will be consumed before the sun even breaches the horizon. Hartmann looks to his gunner, the vibrations of the impending slaughter shaking his bones. Just one shot, he whispers, the weight of command settling like concrete on his shoulders. That's all we need. With zero confirmation, no supporting fire, and facing a guaranteed court-martial regardless of the outcome, Lieutenant Carl Hartmann fires a smoke round. A Hail Mary that will either end his career or save a company. Carl Hartmann was not forged for combat. He was an architect of peace, a third-year engineering student at the University of Michigan, utterly consumed by the mechanical poetry of steel and concrete. He sought harmony in blueprints, not bloodshed. He once wrote to his father, "Designing a suspension bridge is like playing God, but with numbers and bolts." But Pearl Harbor shattered that careful design. Hartmann enlisted, not out of fiery patriotism, but from a calculated inability to stand idle. He chose the Armored Corps because, fundamentally, he trusted the reliability of machines, the M4 Sherman, more than the fragile resolve of men. By the scorching summer of 1944, Hartmann was a 24-year-old lieutenant in Normandy, commanding a Sherman tank crew attached to the veteran 119th Infantry Regiment of the 30th Infantry Division, Old Hickory. They had been grinding eastward, pushing the battered Wehrmacht toward Paris. But Hitler refused to concede the West. Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge launched Operation Luttich, a desperate, last-gasp counterattack aimed at cutting the American corridor, seizing the critical town of Avranches, and trapping the entirety of the Allied armies in the peninsula. This was a suicidal gamble. Germany was starved of fuel and air support. Their armored strength was concentrated in only the most fanatical units, the feared 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich and the brutal 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division Gotz von Berlichingen. The full weight of this desperate offensive landed squarely upon the newly established, fragile American front near Mortagne, where 3 small units. The orders had been simple, blunt, and ultimately fatal. Hold the line. A single, isolated platoon from Company K, augmented by a 4 artillery observer team, was dug in along a vital ridge southwest of the town. They were told to wait 24 hours for promised relief. But war is a savage machine that does not observe the clock. On the suffocating night of August 6th, under a shroud of oppressive darkness and an unnatural, thick fog, the German steel moved. By the gray, choking dawn of August 7th, the men on the ridge understood their grim reality. They weren't holding the high ground. They had been swallowed whole. They were trapped in a low pocket, the jaws of the German counterattack closing tight. Radios shrieked, crackling with raw panic. Panzers had severed the western road. Infantry swarmed up from the south. To the north, unseen German batteries hammered a few American positions, still attempting to shift. There was no exit, only the cold, heavy certainty that everything had gone catastrophically wrong. Inside the cramped, metallic confines of their M4 Sherman, Commander Hartmann fought to keep his voice level, masking the dread coiling in his stomach. His gunner, Private First Class Earl Bishop, a quiet farm boy from Iowa, wrestled his focus onto the primary sight. Beside him, Corporal James Ortega, the crew's volatile blend of poker hustler and explosives expert, slotted rounds with grim efficiency. Behind the controls sat Specialist Anthony Tony Vitelli, a Brooklyn daredevil who swore like a longshoreman and drove their 33 tons of steel like a weapon. Crouching near the buzzing radio was Private George Marks, a 19-year-old Missourian operator who had not spoken a complete sentence in 48 hours. They were not heroes. They were not commandos. They were 5 young men, sealed inside a steel box, armed with a 75mm gun and a dwindling supply of ammunition. Stashed deep in a rack was a single round they were explicitly forbidden to deploy without direct, high-level authorization, a white phosphorus smoke round, meant for emergency concealment or marking targets for inbound B-17 bombers. It was an instrument of last resort. If we're ever truly in the dirt, Hartman had told him weeks ago, his eyes hard, we bend the rules. We live. That moment had arrived. German armor was rolling faster than intelligence reports had dared to predict. Command, the promised voice of salvation, had been silent for 10 minutes. The last message Hartman received echoed like a death knell. Do not engage unless fired upon. Hold your ground. But that ground was shrinking by the second. Hartman watched American infantry spill out of the tree line, wounded, broken, retreating toward his tank. They were scrambling for a road that no longer existed, already under the guns of German forces barely visible through the mist. Hartman's gaze dropped to the round marked SMU, smoke, white phosphorus. His hand hovered just above the explosive canister. Following protocol meant dying in a burning metal coffin. He lifted the shell. The encirclement had begun. At 0530 hours, the fog that sheltered the valley began to shift, offering only tantalizing glimpses of the chaos, never clarity. Visibility remained under 200 yards. Trees stood like specters. Shadows moved with predatory speed. Every faint crunch of gravel sounded like the track of a panzer. The men of Company K, positioned just south of Hartman's Sherman, were now fully exposed. A German reconnaissance unit, expertly utilizing the night's confusion, had found a soft seam in the American line and pushed through, swift and unnoticed. Within the next half hour, they would seize control. The German advance had achieved its objective. Control of the western road, sealing off the only natural retreat path for the Americans holding the ridge. Wartime was no longer a forward position. It had become a trap, the jaws of the pincers beginning to close. Inside the cramped, vibrating hull of his M4 Sherman, Sergeant Hartman listened to the frenetic, drowning chatter on the radio. It was total chaos, a symphony of collapsing resolve. South Slope, we're getting hit from the south. Multiple vehicles requesting fire support. The call came from a forward artillery observer, his voice taut with panic. Then, a new shriek. They're in the trees. I repeat, they're inside the tree line. Command's response was chillingly precise, a measured denial against the rising tide of fear. Negative on fire support. Risk of friendly fire too high. Maintain position. Reinforcements are in transit. Hartman slammed the volume knob down, cutting the useless static. He pressed his face against the periscope, sweeping the scorched earth. East of their hull-down position, within the dense tree line, movement materialized, not the familiar lines of American armor, but short, squat silhouettes. Panzer IVs. 2 o'clock. Hartman barked. 3, maybe 4 of them, closing in. Earl Bishop, the gunner, wrenched the turret's reversing wheel, the heavy metal grating, as a 75mm gun swung to track the threat. Corporal Ortega, the loader, held the armor-piercing round steady. Do we fire, Sergeant? Hartman hesitated. The order was clear. Do not engage unless fired upon. That hesitation ended with a horrific, definitive thunderclap. A German high-explosive shell ripped into the position, held by the artillery observers barely 200 yards to the south. Fireballs erupted, followed by screams that drowned out the engine's roar. There could be no mistaking it. The engagement had begun. Return fire. Hartman roared. Bishop squeezed the firing trigger. The M4 Sherman's gun barked, a violent, shuddering concussion inside the turret. The tracer found its mark. One of the Panzer IVs caught the shell squarely on its flank and erupted into a geyser of flame and thick black smoke. The remaining German tanks scattered, instantly returning fire. The M4 Sherman rocked violently. Dirt and spent metal exploded around them. A shell landed 10 feet short, showering the tank in mud, rocks, and lethal shrapnel. The radio cracked to life again, this time from a runner unit, bypassing the main net. The voice was ragged, desperate. Command has lost contact with 1st Battalion. Mortine is compromised. Units to withdraw to phase line red. Repeat, fall back. Hartman froze. Phase line red meant withdrawing west. Straight onto the road, now confirmed to be under German control. Hell, muttered Tony, the driver. They're telling us to retreat through a road that doesn't exist anymore. Outside the tank, the organized defense had disintegrated into a rout. American infantry units were already moving, retreating in clusters, dragging the wounded, screaming for medics. There was no formation left, only the instinct for survival, hampered by the swirling fog, the intense gunfire, and the complete collapse of command. From the southern slope, the German grenadiers emerged. Machine guns opened up, carving lines through the retreating masses. One GI returned fire with a Browning automatic rifle, a desperate, futile stutter against the overwhelming momentum. The Germans were pressing their advantage, executing the textbook Encirclement. Hartman saw the terrible geometry clearly now. In less than 10 minutes, the enemy troops would close the southern pincer, meeting the armor on the west. If that happened, no one on the ridge would get out alive. His hands clenched the hatch handle. The only logical path was due west, but German armor sealed that route. And yet, something else caught his eye. The wind. The black smoke from the burning Panzer IV was drifting westward, slowly but steadily, toward the German-held sector. Ortega, Hartman said, his voice clipped and intense. You still have that smoke shell? The corporal hesitated, his face etched with confusion. The phosphorus one? Yes, sir, but we're not authorized to deploy. I know what the manual says. Hartman cut him off, turned to face his crew. We're going to buy them a chance. One shot, that's all. We fire that shell due west. We create a wall of smoke. They needed obscurity, a sudden darkness to swallow the ridge. If they hesitate just for a minute, Hartman asserted, his voice tight, we get those boys out. Tony, the pragmatist, raised an eyebrow, the question hanging heavy. And if they don't hesitate? Hartman met his gaze, the grim answer cold as steel. Then we buy time. Nothing more. The silence was crushing, stretching the seconds until they snapped. Then Ortega, the gunner, the decision-maker in this moment, gave the only possible answer. He gave a sharp nod, loading white phosphorus. The loader slammed a massive shell into the breech of the Sherman's main gun. Inside the confined turret, Bishop adjusted the elevation, his breath shallow. Outside, Hartman risked a fatal peek, cracking commander's hatch barely wide enough to see the dying battlefield. Wounded men crawled like broken insects. Others desperately dragged heavy crates of ammunition or vital radio gear. And behind them, inevitable, came the crushing force of German armor, death advancing on steel tracks. He whispered the intent, a mantra more than a command. Let's make some noise. The idea was madness. It was a forbidden smoke shell. The white phosphorus round was never designed for this brutal, direct combat. Officially, smoke rounds were meant to mark coordinates for a distant B-17 strike or mask a planned withdrawal. But not this. Never this. White phosphorus, the Willie Pete. Burned with infernal, searing heat, spreading chaos and indiscriminate blindness. In the wrong hands, or with the slightest shift of the wind, it could turn into a weapon of mass confusion, burning friendly troops alive. Hartman knew every horrific regulation. Yet, as the German advance closed in and the desperate cries of trapped, wounded men scraped against his eardrums, he saw only one clock winding down. Fire, Hartman commanded. Bishop flinched, but only for a heartbeat. The gun recoiled with violent, earth-shaking thump. The white phosphorus shell screamed out of the barrel and detonated exactly where planned, a mere 50 yards west of their position. Instantly, the battlefield was assaulted by a thick, opaque gray plume, pouring into field like a curtain descending upon a ruined stage. Mercifully, the wind held, a steady current pushing the toxic wall directly across the German approach route. The battlefield changed in a blinding instant, facing a sudden, choking wall of chemical smoke where visibility dropped to zero. The German advance ground to a halt. Tanks halted. Infantry froze in their tracks. Through their limited optics, the enemy could see nothing but boiling gray sulfur. American movement, the desperation, the frantic effort, had achieved the invisibility it craved. Move! Hartman roared into the radio, his voice ragged but clear. All units, west now. Use the smoke. Go! Along the contested ridge, the scattered American pockets erupted into motion. Infantrymen burst from shallow cover, sprinting toward the western slope. Medics abandoned their packs, hoisting stretchers. Artillery crews discarded heavy, useless gear, grabbing rifles and dragging each other to the swirling haze. Some carried the wounded. Others simply ran. Inside the Sherman, Hartman subtly rotated the turret, maintaining the menacing silhouette. If they fire through it, he stated, we hit them back, but only if they fire first. We hold the illusion. Ortega, wiping sweat from his brow, demanded, what illusion? Hartman smiled, a grim, humorless twist of the mouth. That we planned this. To the Germans, the world had simply gone dark. The abrupt appearance of heavy smoke, coinciding precisely with the vanishing of the American perimeter, triggered immediate paranoia. Some German commanders instantly feared a massive counterattack. Others panicked, anticipating a concentrated artillery barrage. In reality, it was nothing more than 5 desperate men inside a tank, gambling everything on a puff of poison and the fickle nature of fear. For 90 agonizing seconds, the battlefield was silent, and in that crucial minute and a half, the bulk of the remaining American forces on the ridge slipped into the cover, disappearing toward the rear lines. Hartman, the orchestrator of this desperate ballet, watched the impossible retreat unfold with clinical, unnerving precision. Hartman measured life in tenths of a second, clocking the silhouette of every Stahlhelm that dared breach the smoky horizon. A strange, suffocating silence gripped the battlefield, a mutual holding of breath. The German lines were frozen, the Americans inert. Even the massive, menacing shape of the nearby Panzer seemed to wait, its cannon snout fixed and motionless. Then the silence shattered. A German MG-42 ripped open the left flank, a frantic, screaming deluge of steel tearing into the obscurity. Panic was contagious. A second machine gun joined the chorus, followed by the deafening, visceral bark of a Panzer S main gun, spitting high explosive blindly into fog. Instinct took over. Bishop, suppressing fire, hit the flash. Hartman didn't have to explain the gamble, make the enemy believe the line held. The Sherman tank surged back into the fight. Its 75mm gun cracked, sending a punishing high explosive round directly into muzzle flash's source. The thicket vanished in a shock wave of heat and a blossoming orange fireball. The calculated explosion worked. It bought precious seconds. 200 desperate American infantrymen were already using that artificial chaos to slip into the safety of the smoke screen. The gamble had paid off. Hartman felt the tension bleed out his shoulders, a ragged, shaky exhale. Sweat pooled beneath his helmet liner, and his fingers trembled against the controls. Command going to approve of that stunt, Skipper? Vitelli's voice was strained, thick with adrenaline. Hartman managed a grim, exhausted smile. Command will approve that we're breathing. Move it out, everyone. But the crew hesitated. The white phosphorus smoke rolled across the ground, a churning, living gray curtain that smelled of burning phosphorus and fear. Hope wrapped in ash. To many it felt too easy, too sudden. Then a single shout echoed to the lines. They're covering us! Move! The spell broke. The ridge exploded into motion. Men sprinted, limped, and dragged their wounded westward, shedding unnecessary weight. Helmets, ripped ammo pouches, anything to increase their velocity toward the sanctuary of a mist. The scattered retreat transformed into a desperate, orchestrated exodus. And right at the lip of the smoke, Hartman Sherman sat, its steel hull the final, visible guardian between the infantry and the German fury. "Keep the barrel moving," Hartman commanded, forcing the turret to rotate slowly, selling the illusion of a full battle line. "Ammo status." Bishop replied immediately. "For armor-piercing, too high explosive, 0 smoke." 6 rounds. That was all the bluff they had left. The thick, acrid veil of smoke, combined with the earlier white phosphorus, had blinded the entire sector. Inside the Sherman, visibility dropped to less than 20 yards. They watched shadows flicker through the gray. Running men, limping figures, stretchers borne on tired shoulders. German officers, terrified of walking into a prepared counterattack or an artillery trap, held their men fast. No one wanted to be the first to charge blindly into the gray void. This calculated paralysis saved hundreds of lives. A group of forward observers sprinted past the Sherman, coughing violently. One slammed his fist against the roaring engine housing. "Nice trick, tanker," he gasped, disappearing into fog. "You just saved our damn lives." Hartman ignored the relief in the driver's voice. His attention was chained to the damp map draped over his knees, calculating the impossible, where the new defensive spine could possibly anchor itself. Men continued to pour past the tank, phantoms emerging from the billowing, manufactured fog. Some were silent, their faces etched with the shock of combat. Others moved like broken saints, whispering frantic prayers, slinging curses, or simply crying the names of the friends who had vanished moments before. Then came the final wave, the trailing elements of Company K. They moved like wounded animals, dragging heavy bodies on stretchers improvised from torn canvas and bent poles. A sergeant, wild-eyed and bleeding from his shoulder, slammed his hand on the M4 Sherman's hull. "Asterisk, they're closing. Sir, you have to run. Now!" Asterisk. Hartman acknowledged the warning with a clipped nod. He waited, a lifetime measured in heartbeats, until the last staggering silhouette melted into the opaque screen. "Tony!" he barked into the intercom, his voice rasping. "Punch it. We are the rear guard. We are the last out." The massive General Motors engine roared, a deep mechanical exhale. The heavy tracks chewed through gravel and pulverized earth, pushing the M4 Sherman west into the smoke column they had intentionally created. Hartman kept the hatch ajar, his head exposed to the stinging soot, his eyes frantically scanning the gray-white world for movement, friend or foe. The ambush was sudden. A blinding flare of orange light ripped open a haze to the right. A German MG-42 opened fire, stitching a deadly invisible seam through the fog. Rounds, hard, vicious, .30 caliber slugs, punished the steel hull. The M4 Sherman rocked violently as a glancing hit sheared a rivet near the driver's vision port. "Return fire. Suppression only," Hartman yelled, instinctively dropping into the turret well. Bishop, the gunner, reacted instantly. The turret motor whined, swiveling the main gun toward the sound. A high explosive, round tore from the barrel, annihilating the approximate source of the noise. The resulting concussion blasted a temporary hole in the smoke, illuminating a pulverized section of tree line and the fleeting silhouette of the enemy gun crew before the curtain of gray dust dropped again. Silence returned, absolute and paralyzing. They pressed on, the M4 Sherman forging a path through the debris field. Burnout jeeps, abandoned helmets, rifles stuck bayonet first into the soil. It was a graveyard in motion. 3 grueling minutes later, they reached the precipice of the smoke trail. The transition was jarring. The morning sun, previously smothered by combat, now pierced the eastern fog, washing the landscape in pale, hopeful light. And there, just beyond the final ridge, stood Salvation, the American fallback line. It was chaos, but it was organized chaos. Dozens of men huddled behind hastily piled sandbags, supply trucks, and makeshift timber barricades. Medics sprinted, leaving trails of bloody gauze. Officers, mouths pressed tight against the handsets, barked coordinates into crackling field radios. A crew was already setting up a heavy Browning M2 machine gun on a tripod, its menacing profile promising resistance. It was not pretty, but it was home. As the M4 Sherman crested the rise and its imposing shape appeared, a ragged cheer erupted along the defensive line. They had made it. The tanks were still rolling. Hartman raised a soot-stained hand from the hatch, a tired salute mixed with profound relief. Behind them, the smoke still billowed, thick and defiant, buying the last precious seconds. A few more stragglers coughed their way free of the gray curtain, stumbling, bleeding, but fundamentally alive. The enemy encirclement had collapsed. The Germans had hesitated, momentarily blinded and disoriented. And in that crucial pause, the Americans had slipped away. All because of one critical shot, one forbidden smoke round. Inside the steel confines of the tank, Ortega finally expelled the breath he'd been holding since the retreat began. "Next time someone calls smoke rounds useless," he muttered, "I swear I'm going to punch them." But Telly, the loader, offered a dry laugh. "Next time someone says we're out of options, I'm going to tell them to wait for the wind." Hartman said nothing. He simply looked back over his shoulder, watching the miraculous smoke trail begin to dissipate into the strengthening daylight. Survival had become success. The morning sun climbed higher, scattering the final vestiges of the man-made fog. What was once a brutal, chaotic battlefield now resembled the aftermath of a violent storm. Scattered equipment, splintered trees, and patches of scorched earth. But through that broken landscape, nearly 200 American soldiers had passed and lived. The M4 Sherman rolled to a stop behind a hastily constructed sandbag emplacement. A medic rushed forward, ready to check the crew for shrapnel or concussion, but Hartman waved him off firmly. "We're fine," he said, the word tasting of smoke and victory. "Check the others." Around him, the survivors did not slump. They simply collapsed. They gulped water, hacking up the residual grit. Silence was their only shared language, a heavy acknowledgement of the abyss they had skirted. They all knew how close the sickle had swung. A lieutenant from Kilo Company, his face a mask of soot and sweat, stumbled toward Lieutenant Hartman. Hartman was still dusting the white ash from his tanker's jacket. The officer gripped Hartman's arm, not shaking his hand, but hauling him into reality. "You bought us minutes we didn't possess. I don't know what devilry that was, but it worked." Hartman met his gaze. "Just smoke, Lieutenant." The man's smile was thin and brittle. "The best damn smoke I have ever breathed." Back at regimental headquarters, the initial reports were a symphony of collapse. Communication severed, units disintegrating, enemy strength dangerously miscalculated. There was every indication that Mortain, today, was destined to be recorded as a catastrophic tactical stain on an otherwise relentless advance. Then, the first desperate messages began to filter through. Not reports of retreat, but of escape. They detailed how one renegade tank crew, defying all standing orders, had unleashed a thick plume of white phosphorus, using the poisonous smoke to blind German reconnaissance and halt the subsequent rush of heavy armor. The act had delayed the enemy, confused their coordination, and preserved 2 full infantry platoons and a critical forward artillery team. Only 14 men were wounded. Dozens had been pulled from the furnace. Some witnesses described it as a miracle. But command did not often tolerate miracles, especially ones delivered without authorization. By the humid afternoon of August 7th, Lieutenant Hartman and his gunner were summoned to a mobile command post. A sterile, pressurized box dropped into the mud. Colonel Raymond Sloan, a divisional staff officer whose rigid devotion to regulations was legendary, did not offer a seat. He didn't waste a second. "You deployed white phosphorus against field protocol," Sloan stated, his voice flat as he stabbed a finger at a clipboard. "No authorization, no prior clearance, no confirmation of air or artillery coordination. That, Lieutenant, is a direct violation of standing engagement rules." Hartman snapped to attention. "Yes, sir. I take full responsibility." Sloan peered over the rim of his spectacles, his expression chillingly neutral. "Do you have any idea what would have happened if the wind had shifted?" Hartman looked the colonel square in the eye. "Yes, sir," he replied. "We would have died anyway." A heavy silence settled in the canvas tent. Then A new voice broke the tension. Major Aniston, the operations officer for the 30th Division, looked up from his own sheaf of papers. "Sir," he said quietly, addressing the colonel, "they saved 192 personnel, including all 3 forward observers. Without that smoke, we'd be retrieving dog tags today." Colonel Sloan finally looked away from the report. He did not smile, nor did he offer a defense of the regulations. "You will receive a formal review," he stated to Hartman, "but unofficially well done." No medal was presented. No ceremony was scheduled. Just a grudging acknowledgement that, in war, the wrong decision often yields a right outcome. In the days that followed, the battle for Mortain ground on. The Germans failed to recapture the high ground. Their desperate counterattack stalled. Air superiority returned once the weather cleared, and American forces pushed east again. The smoke on that hill became a single, obscure footnote in the divisional history. But to the men who stood in the shadow of the apple trees 1 week later, gathered for a small, impromptu service led by a weary chaplain, no crosses, no speeches, just a shared silence of survival, that smoke was everything. Lieutenant Carl Hartman stood silent, the fragile hum of nervous relief surrounding him. He hadn't sought praise. He hadn't sought attention. When pressed by those who survived on the cunning, fatal simplicity of his decision, the forbidden smoke, he offered only a soldier's fatalistic shrug. "You get one clear shot sometimes," he murmured, his gaze distant. "The real soldier's trick is knowing exactly when to pull the trigger." 5 days later, the reckoning arrived. The formal review convened inside a requisitioned schoolhouse, a scarred, temporary divisional headquarters. Artillery fire had long ago shattered the window panes, leaving the air thick with the unsettling scent of damp chalk dust mixed with high-octane diesel fumes. Hartman arrived alone. His boots gleamed, a small defiance against the mud of the war. His uniform starched, his bearing rigid. This was not a moment for his crew. This was the court-martial shadow hanging over one man and one impossible decision. The board was a tribunal of brass and bureaucracy, a major specializing in logistics, a legal advisor whose precision was chilling, and, seated center, a combat veteran, his uniform heavy with the muted glimmer of the Silver Star. He had fought the length of the Mediterranean, from Salerno to Anzio. The tone was surgical. They demanded precise recall the morning of August 7th, the Wehrmacht's disposition, the treacherous wind shifts, the condition of the terrain, and the proximity of friendly units. And then the final, procedural strike, why he had deployed the banned instrument, the white phosphorus round. Hartman recounted the desperation without a tremor of apology or a single moment of self-justification. His conclusion was brutal in its simplicity. "I judged that smoke was the only thing that would delay the enemy long enough for our people to escape. And it did." A heavy, echoing silence fell across the broken room. The legal officer was the first to attack, his voice sharp as broken glass. "Lieutenant Hartman, are you aware that, in any other circumstance, the unauthorized use of white phosphorus could be ground for severe disciplinary action, possibly court-martial?" "Yes, sir. Fully aware. The logistics major pressed the tactical risk. Do you understand the lethal risks you placed on friendly units downwind, the potential for catastrophic casualties if the wind had betrayed you?" "Yes, sir," Hartman repeated, never breaking eye contact. Then the combat veteran leaned forward. He hadn't been reviewing procedure. He had been reading souls. "I read every line of the after-action report," he stated, his voice a low gravel. "You knew the risks. You made the call anyway. You didn't just fight, Lieutenant. You gambled against the odds, and you won." He let the statement hang. "That," the veteran concluded, turning to his colleagues, "takes more than guts. That takes command judgment." There was no objection. The final report was clipped and revolutionary. Lieutenant Carl Hartman acted outside standard protocol, but in accordance with battlefield necessity and sound tactical judgment. No disciplinary action recommended. Unofficial word, however, raced through the divisions faster than a jeep. The reckless gamble was now curriculum. Within a week, officers from 3 different fronts requested briefings from Hartman. They needed to know exactly how he gauged the wind, how he calculated the lethal spread of the forbidden smoke, how long he knew the reprieve would last. By early September, a quiet, seismic directive filtered through the armored units. In defined, desperate circumstances, smoke deployment could now be authorized at the discretion of the field commander if it demonstrably increased the likelihood of unit survival. The rules of engagement had been altered quietly, definitively, by one lieutenant's moment of audacity. Hartman and his tested crew were swiftly rotated out of the grinding mortar sector and transferred closer to the jagged German border, destined for the dark, claustrophobic fighting that awaited them in the Hürtgen forest and the ensuing carnage of the Battle of the Bulge. They had survived the cauldron of Mortain. They had weathered the freezing, indiscriminate terror of the Bulge. Yet the war machine rarely paused for sentiment, even for heroes. In November that year, Hartman received his reward. No parade ground, no brass band, just a flimsy, typed notice contained within a small, government-issue envelope. A clerk, detached and efficient, slid a small velvet box across a scarred quartermaster's desk. The Bronze Star, awarded for meritorious service in direct support of combat operations. There was no ceremony, no photographer capturing the moment. Hartman simply signed the form, collected the decoration, and stared at the box, heavy with unspoken weight, before tucking it deep into his duffel bag. Later that night, under the dim, flickering lantern light, Ortega broke the silence. "You would tell your folks back home about it?" Hartman shrugged, the gesture weighted by too much fighting. They'd probably ask what took them so long. Vitelli leaned closer, a ghost of a grin tracing his lips. "You ever think they'll put your smoke trick in the manual, Sarge?" Hartman managed a faint, weary smile. "Maybe, but I hope no one ever has to use it again." This was not the kind of glory broadcast in newsreels. There were no victory arches. But among the men who had walked through that caustic curtain of white smoke and lived, men who knew the difference between command and consequence, Hartman's name became something greater than his rank. It became absolute trust. And on the blood-soaked chessboard war, trust was a commodity far rarer and infinitely more valuable than any metal. Historians would later pore over the records of the Battle of Mortain, classify it not for its grand scale, but for the profound strategic truth it unveiled. On paper, the German counterattack, dubbed Operation Lüttich, was a stroke of ruthless genius. It involved more than 100 armored vehicles, spearheaded by the elite, iron-fisted SS Panzer divisions. Their objective was monumental: drive west of Avanches and split the fragile Allied front in two. Had they succeeded, the entire momentum forged in the wake of D-Day would have fractured completely. But they failed. And while Allied air power and coordinated heavy artillery played a massive role in turning back the German tide, the margin between catastrophe and victory hinged on a single, unforeseen event: the action on the ridge outside Mortain on August 7, 1944. Military analysts, dissecting the battle months later, focused on the immediate, crippling psychological effect of Hartman's sudden smoke deployment. The German infantry commander, leading the mechanized push toward the ridge, recorded the chilling realization in his field log: asterisk visibility ceased. Enemy position unclear. Feared ambush under cover of chemical screen. Ordered temporary hold of advance. Asterisk. That momentary paralysis lasted precisely 12 minutes. 12 minutes is nothing on a calendar, but in the vortex of combat, 12 minutes was an eternity. It was the window the Americans needed to escape the encirclement. 12 minutes changed everything. From a strategic standpoint, the incident reinforced a truth as old as warfare itself. Information and perception matter as much as raw firepower. The Germans, though better equipped and often more experienced, hesitated because they could not pierce the screen. They did not know what overwhelming force might lie beyond the caustic white curtain. Hesitation in war is the silent, efficient killer. And in this case, it was the unlikely savior. Hartman's quiet action sparked a seismic, though subtle, shift in doctrine. Armored training schools began incorporating the flexible, rapid deployment of smoke into tactical maneuvers. Smoke rounds were no longer treated as a desperate, last-ditch contingency, but as a proactive tactical asset, a force multiplier when used with perfect timing, terrain advantage, and meteorological accuracy. It was not a dramatic change, but it was fundamental and lasting. The grand public would never read the story of the man and his smoke, but the legacy of those 12 minutes was now woven into the fabric of the fighting man's survival manual. The flash of that moment never made the front page headlines. No newsreels ever featured Carl Hartman or his crew, but for the men pinned down in the mud that afternoon, it was a turning point etched forever into their consciousness. Private First Class Harold Jensen, his legs shattered by shrapnel, later dictated a letter to his wife. It stands today, archived by the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. "I don't know the name of the guy in the tank who fired that smoke round," he wrote, "but I know this. I owe him everything." We all do. Corporal Elias Ford, another survivor pulled from the jaws of that engagement, titled a chapter of his post-war memoir simply, "The Wall of Smoke." His description is chilling, the terror visceral. "We were dead men walking. Then the world turned gray, and through that gray, we found our way home." For Hartman, the legacy was quieter, almost invisible. He declined the chance to remain in the military's embrace. Instead, he returned to the University of Michigan, finished his engineering degree, and traded tank maneuvers for blueprints, designing vehicle safety systems for a Detroit automobile company. There's a profound irony in this. The man who bent military rules to save soldiers with unauthorized smoke rounds would go on to pioneer structural innovations that saved thousands of civilian lives on America's highways. He carried the silence of the war like an extra skin. When his children years later pressed him for details, he offered only a cryptic summary, loud, fast, and full of choices you don't get to make twice. But a secret remained. A single yellowed file marked A.R. Morting Ridge engagement sat tucked away in the back of his closet. Inside, faded with time, was a battle map, a crew photo, and a lone, meticulously polished shell casing. Decades passed. Uniforms were boxed away, medals forgotten in dresser drawers. Then, at age 62, recently retired, Carl Hartman wrote a final, reflective letter to his younger sister. It was a passage never intended for anyone else, a raw articulation of the choice that defined him. "I can still smell the smoke," he confessed. "Not the burning kind. The kind that hides you, that wraps around you like a second chance." He laid bare the cost of disobedience. "I wasn't supposed to use it. We were supposed to hold the line, follow orders, die like good soldiers if needed." But the sight of his fellow infantrymen changed everything. Watching those men out there, scared, bleeding, still try to carry each other, I just couldn't let them die for the sake of protocol. That day, the battlefield taught me something no manual ever could. Sometimes the only right choice is the one they didn't teach you to make. That letter, discovered years after his passing, was ultimately donated to the U.S. Army Heritage and Education Center in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. It now anchors a display titled "Split-Second Decisions, Tactical Genius in the Field." There are no statues of Carl Hartman, no documentaries, no best-selling memoirs. Only a quiet archive holds the testimony of a man who bent history's rules with a single, unauthorized act of judgment. And maybe that is the real lesson. That history doesn't remember you for what you were ordered to do, but for the choice you made when no one else would.